Hello, welcome to today's video. I'm going to explore how I went about solving one of the business analysts here at Daisy Hill request to select specific columns out of the pivot table that we generated in an earlier video. And if you follow along in that video when it was recorded, you saw that we took the birth, performance, and training information and pivot that into weeks so that it can be reported. This business analyst found that what they are doing is wanting to narrow in on a specific week within this pivot table, as well as the week before and the week after, which would be essentially something like this. And they found it easy to use a select statement and run through their analysis one time. But they were wondering if there was a method by which an app could be generated so that this reporting could be done dynamically without having to go in and edit the workflow each time. Part of the takeaway from this video you will probably find is that editing it, the workflow each time you want to do this, is probably the easiest way to go. But that not getting in the way, I decided to attack this problem so that I could see if another solution was at hand. I explored a couple of ways of solving this problem. Basically choosing out these three columns from in the middle of the pivot table. But this sort of comes along with any time that you're trying to determine which columns you want to see, especially when something that is changing over time and would be in a sequence, and choosing where that sequence is in the middle. So jumping into this, I was sort of in a mood of looking at the transpose and the crosstab widgets, which are the pivot and unpivots, to solve this more programmatically. Other solutions that I looked at and might have been just as easy, one which maybe not quite so easy. One is just simply coming up with a very complex formula that would take the date and then from that date generate the week of that date, the previous week, and the next week. It is an extremely complex function, and I try to avoid going into complex functions, especially for these videos, because most business analysts have a hard time with the complex functions, as well as something slightly askew in there just destroys the whole function. And you also have to deal more directly with the edge issues, such as the end of the year or the beginning of the year, in doing that. The other solution that was potentially there and I explored as well, which is to create a multi-part application where the first part would go ahead and get the list of columns and allow them to choose which columns they want, and then feed that into the second step of the application. And that, as hindsight, might have been the easier way of going, but we've done that in a video previously, so I decided just to go ahead and to play some games with transpose, as well as giving another plugin there for generating a date dimension. So let's go ahead and take a look at stepping into this problem. I'm going to a degree, sort of try to glaze over the beginning of this, because no matter which way you went at the beginning, what you end up towards the end has to be the same no matter which of those options you take. But it allows me to play around with my date dimension. So what I start out with, I always recommend you do, is understanding the data that you're first bringing into it. Here is my date dimension. Let's go ahead and run this. This is my date dimension, has all my dates. One of the things inside of my date is not only the calendar date and the ID, but it also has the week of the year number. And you can see that matches what we have in our column. So that's sort of the direction I went to. I wanted to go ahead and test just a normal date, the end of the year and the beginning of the year, make sure that all three of these would return good results once I did so. And then I began to bring the data together. So running through this quickly, what we want to do is to find out what week of the year this data is. That's pretty straightforward and simple. All that we want to do here is to join on the left the calendar date and on the right the base date. And that will go ahead and give us the week of the year number that we want. We want to keep the base date here just for reference purposes at this time. We don't need the calendar date. That's because of the join. We can run this through very quickly, and you can see that as we expected, we get one record out of here, the week of the year number and the base date that's we needed to see. So again, my thought process is maybe different than your thought process. So what I want to find from this is I want to find the beginning of this week and the end of this week so that I can go back one day and forward one day, and then between those three pieces of data, I'll know what the previous week of the year was, the current week of the year, and the following week of the year. So now that I have the week of the year number, I can just join this data back in again. So joining back in with that, what I want on the left at this point in time is the week of the year number. Automatically populates it in there for me. I only need one of these weeks of the year. We don't need both. But I do need that calendar date this time, so I'll leave that in there. Run this through, and you can see that now I have the 7 days that are associated with the week of the year. And I want to find this first date and this last date. So we can just begin to drop in some that you're more comfortable with using. So we'll drop in the summarize because we have the min and the max functions. So we want to take this calendar date, add into it the min, give this a better name, which is start of week. And we want to add in the max. So again, what I'm doing here is just go ahead and massaging this to get the pieces of data that I need out of it in order to determine exactly where I want to go with the columns. We are going to drop in a formula here. It's a pretty simple formula. What we want to do is to take one off the min date. We're going to add a column. We're going to call this end of previous week. That's pretty simple because now all I want to do is do my date time add, one of those formulas that I run into using a lot of the time. Very useful. If we deal with the start of the week and we want to go backwards one day, that will give me the, run this through, we can see what it looks like. That will go ahead and give me the start of the week, the end of the week, and the end of the previous week. You notice I do the things I like to do a lot, which is don't set that data type. Quick annotation is calc range of dates. Come back to my formula from a configuration standpoint. And this is not a string, this is a date. I'll remember to do it the next time. But again, it's just why you just sort of run things one step at a time. Finds all the simple little problems you create for yourself. So we're going to add a column here. It's going to be the start of next week. Since I've already learned that this mistake or learn changes to the date, all we want to do here is we want to go ahead and add a day to the end of the current week. So do another date time add. Make this bigger so you can see it. Now we're going to be looking at the end of the week. And we now want to add one day. Now, one you might ask is why do you not just simply add a week to it? Well, one of the problems with adding a week or 7 days is that you skip by those end of the year and beginning of the year problems, and you may have to adjust for them. So just simply going in here this way quickly deals with it. So we run this through, and we can now see this is the start of the week, the end of the week, end of the previous week, and the start of next week. We don't want all of this data. We only need 3 of these, not 4 of these. So we will use our select on here, and we will remove off the end of the week. So we're left with just the start of the week, the end of the previous week, and the start of the next week. If you see where this is going, kudos. If not, we'll step through it, because what I want to do is to go ahead and use these 3 dates to find out which weeks they are in by getting them back into this date dimension. But the problem, as far as doing a join is concerned, is that we have one record with 3 values, and what I want is 3 records. Run this through real quick. I want each of these to be a record. This is where we now jump into our transforms, and we can use the transpose. Again, you can notice the top is going to turn columns into rows. Drop that in here. We don't need to do any key columns. And the data columns are start of the week, end of the week, and then start of the next week. We don't want to have any dynamics in here just in case something occurs unrecognizable in the future. So what this will do is turn each of these into their own record. We can run that, and sure enough, here you see is that we have the name and we have the value. And now all we need to do is to go ahead and join this back out again. Again, you can see how many times I'm using this date dimension. It's nice because it really doesn't have to read it 3 times. It processes it. So on the left in this join, we didn't bother changing the name of these columns because it was not necessary. So what we have is a calendar date from the date dimension. And on the right, we have the value. And what we want to come out with here simply is the week number from each one of those. So we can turn off these here, run this through, and now we have the week of the year number. At this point in time, it happens to be a date, or excuse me, it happens to be an integer, and we want to turn it into a character string because that is what it's going to, looking forward, see what our column names are going to enter into a separate workflow. So we'll drop one last select on here. We don't have to use a function to convert that. We just want to take the defaults from a conversion standpoint. And all we do is we change this to a string 6. We run that, and you can see that coming out of here is our string. Check on metadata. And it has the 3 weeks of the year that we want to analyze from this starting date. And then just to verify that this works, we can go ahead and disconnect and run each of these to get our edge conditions. And you notice we get this silly little week in here, which is 2200. There is leftovers at the end or beginning of years, depending upon how the year breaks. And that's the ones that we want to make sure we called correctly, and we did in this case. And so here we're taking a look at the beginning of the year and making sure that we go backwards properly as well. And you can see once again we've chosen the wedge or leftovers for the year at the beginning, as well as 1 and 2 for the week. So we know now we've covered edge conditions with this very directly. Going forward then, we can turn this off. And we don't really need these. We can either leave them here or drop them down a little bit lower. I'm going to drop them out of the way, because now as I get ready to do the rest of this development work, it's going to be a little bit more direct, but I want to save some space. And so I will bring in one of my favorites, which is the tool container. We're going to call this Find Weeks. So now I can take these off of the space that I have. I know this works. I want to leave something coming in and something coming out just for my development purposes. So I can go ahead and drop this into here. So in the middle, I now have a container that is the calculations for finding weeks. If you don't like the way I did this, you have your own method of finding those weeks. That's where you would plug it into this area here. And we will work on the second part of this, which is to actually choose the rows that we want to see out of the pivot table spreadsheet. Don't forget, you can also now minimize this, which is the whole point. Drag this down, so I'm having something feeding into it. I have these extras just floating around here for later usage. And then we will begin to work here with the next step. So hopefully you can see where we're heading, and that is to use our transpose and crosstab functions to restructure our data to make it easier to use the existing logical operations of join and filter, etc., to find what we need. And it's good to understand that taking your data apart and putting it back together again can make your workflow development much easier. To that method, let's go ahead and bring in our next piece of data, which is the actual spreadsheet. So I bring in my pivot table spreadsheet. I choose off basically all the columns that we have there. And for this purposes, we're going to more or less keep things the way they are. But there's ways that you might want to pre-manipulate this data to get it to be more rationalized, but it's good just this way. One thing that if you remember this data, just as a preliminary step, that we have the subtotals and the grand total that we probably don't want to have in this data set, and it's easy just to strip it off at the beginning. Keep in mind that when we built this, this is not an empty or null field. We put spaces around it just as a placeholder. So we're going to get a little creative in our filter to remove those. And all that we want to do is we will start with the basic filter, choosing our column, which is the kennel name in this case. And it allows us in this to do some simple basic filtering, but we want to go custom, and I always like to start with things being just as a placeholder. So what we want to know is if it is not empty, that's the not identifier, is empty, is the function that we want to use in this case. But note that we have already determined, just finish this up to make sure it balances, that this was not empty, but it was rather spaces. We can turn it into empty by simply trimming it. So you can take something that is completely blanks, turn it into an empty or null field by simply trimming out all of the white space, which turns it into the simple verification or filtering that we want to do. Having said that, we can now look at the false side, and there are all those subtotals and the total coming out. There's other filters you could have used, but in my mind that was the simplest one, and I had that in planning when I built that data set originally to help the business analysts post-process this data if they needed to. Little did I know it was going to be me. So now what I want to do is to find just those columns that match our data set. But again, you can't query into columns. You cannot do a filter for columns, simply for values. So we want to turn those columns into rows so we can filter the rows that we need. Step one of this process is the transpose that we've had before. In this case, we're going to need to get a little bit more discrete in our definition, or more complex, which way you want to look at it. But essentially, breed name, chemical name, and event type are what we want to keep at the beginning of the rows. All the other fields are what we want to use into creating records that have a name and a value. As you can see when we run through this data, again, I always like to point out, run this every time you add a new widget into it, see how it's going. So now we have each of our individual columns as a row. It becomes a simple matter to drop a join in here, hooking up the left and the right. This is the dates that we want. These are the dates that are in the name columns. So in doing that, we want to go ahead and on the left choose the week of year number. It's the only thing we have. Remember, we turned it into a string strip so that we could do this coming into it. If you didn't do that, you'd get a warning message and then you would go back and change it yourself. But I knew what was coming, so occasionally I can look forward and see what's going on. But this is where we have name. Running this through again, you see now we're down to a limited number of records. And it is all the ones that have that year and week number that was originally the column. Now it is the name of the record in the row. So things are back to being just the data set that we want. However, our business analysts wanted to see it in tabular format. So what we can simply do is use the cross tab to undo our transpose. And in doing so, we have to make sure we identify it properly, which is that we have these. We have one extra column in there that we don't need. Let's go ahead and remove that. Drop the select in here. We don't need this week of year number anymore. We simply have the data that we want. Now going into the cross tab, we have the three columns that identify the records. We want to bring name back into a column, heading or field name, and we want to bring the value what's in there. And again, reminder, and the only part about that gets a little dicey is that this is a summarize function, and you have to identify what to do if you have multiple records. That can be very useful for you if you're trying, you don't need to do a summarize before doing the cross tab, but in our case, we've already have things at a discrete level. And so just to make the widget happy, I like to choose first, even though we do not have any duplicates. And then finally, we want to drop a browse onto the end of this. Run this through, and you can see that now we've gone into having just our identifying columns and then our fields for each of those 3 weeks that we wanted to come out from that spreadsheet. So that was getting creative and using our transpose to take the data apart, filtering or joining to do a filter, and then putting the cross tab in here to put the data back together again. This now is the data set that the business analyst wants to use. And while they would probably be very happy with just being able to go in here and putting a date in this field and letting everything flow through directly, they still were looking at getting down into an application. Since this is going to be an application, and I'm probably going to be the only one that has to manage it or maintain it, to make my life a little bit easier in developing this and looking at this, we're going to go ahead and consolidate or use our documentation tool container. And this is columns, 2 rows, 2 columns. So we can go ahead and copy all of this in. And again, I like to leave something inside and something outside. So we will not include that browse. We can minimize this. So here is the second step of what we did. First step was finding the week. Second step was the columns to rows and back to columns again. Here is our end result coming out of it. This is my extra test data. And I am just going to leave that here because why throw it away at this point in time? It now looks good. We want to turn this into an application. This becomes probably one of the easier applications that you would need to build. So we go to our interface category. There is something to help us right here called date. And I want to do just a quick prompt, which is choose centered date. Possibly not the best prompt, but it gets the job done. What we're going to want to do is to change this base date with the date that they chose from the interface widget. We do that with an action. We drop our action down here, drag it up there, look at its configuration, and by default, it's going to go ahead and update the cell that we have, so we really don't have to do any configuration ourselves. If you don't like the way this looks, nice thing here is just simply move it to the side a little bit. There we go. Looks better that way. So if you choose a date, we'll get the columns back out of it. Remember, we'll look at these dates as well. But the way this executes is by using the wand, which runs the workflow as the analytic app that we created. But before we do that, we also want to make sure you can see the output. We do that through the interface designer. If you don't have this turned on, you turn it on through views. Hit the properties. When it's success, we want to see the browse data. So let's go ahead and run this. Pops it up. Now my mind is going back to saying, what was some good dates that we used for this? Well, let's just choose something in March. So here's March 16th, which means that we want to see the week ending on the 12th, the 19th, and the 26th. Choose that, hit the finish button. Here's our data set coming out of it. And here are the weeks that we need to see. That can be now post-processed within the workflow that the business analyst had requested. What I would do is ask them where they want me to put this data so that they can actually use it, which would be putting it probably on a shared drive or on their local drive, and then they can run this application themselves, saving the data and going. But we'll leave that to you to determine how you would best like to solve that and to turn this over to the business analyst. Hope this helps you understand how you can remanipulate data that seems hard to determine what to do. The main focus of this was not just to solve the problem, which is choosing specific columns out of your data set, but if you have a data set that is progressive within some type of ordered columns and you want to choose a range based on one of the columns, this is one way you can solve that problem, turning into a very simple application that allows it to be more useful to the user community that you support, or for you to use it in the future without having to figure out how to manipulate your workflow manually and then run it. Hopefully this helped. Any questions about billing applications, but more specifically any questions about how Transpose and Crosstab can help restructure your data so that you can solve what looks like a complex problem much more easily. Again, apologize a little bit for how hard it is to find the weeks, but that was really the problem that I was trying to address with the business analyst, and I thought you might like to see one way to solve that, a bunch of widgets put together to do that with, but I found that to be the easier, more direct method than utilizing a very complex formula. And in case you're trying to do formulas to do dates, you can look at using the widgets and tools available to you within Alteryx to solve what looks like a complex formula into a less complex, but possibly just as many steps in it from a functional standpoint. Drop me some comments, please subscribe, check back for future videos as I begin to try to share more information with you. Have a great day.